Hello, welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's April 19th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be your host. If you have questions for Helga or comments, you can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them in the chat room, and Anastasia will get them to me. Now, we just had a conference last weekend, which was organized by Helga and the Schiller Institute, which provided a panorama of the dangers in the present strategic conjuncture, as well as an in-depth dialogue on significant moves to break from the present unipolar order, and especially the potential for an alliance between the nations of the global South and the Europeans and the Americans if the latter two were to break from this unipolar order. I'd like to begin, Helga, with your assessment on where things stand in the present crisis following our conference, and also any comments you might have on the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Japan, where it became absolutely clear that they have no other idea but to continue the policy of permanent warfare and scarcity.
Well, I got several responses to the conference which noted an obvious point, and that is the absolute contrast between the approach we have taken at this and other Schiller Institute conferences and the stubborn confrontationist line by the G7. I think our conference provided an approach how you solve problems which are very difficult to solve by applying a specific philosophical method. We discussed this, the coincidence of opposites coming from Nikolaus of Cusa, Leibniz idea, and other great thinkers. You have to apply philosophical conceptions and the best conceptions mankind has produced in each culture if you are confronted with a crisis like that. And what the G7 does instead, and they just proved it with their rather terrible meeting which they had in Japan, the G7 foreign ministers, where all they could do is asking for more war against Russia, more weapons, more sanctions, more confrontation, and basically accusing China of doing things which they themselves are doing. So it is quite understandable that Wang Wenbin, the spokesman of the Foreign Ministry of China, completely refused this and basically said that they do not allow, or they completely oppose the effort by the G7 to interfere in the internal affairs of China. I mean, this refers obviously to Taiwan, where the G7 claims that that China is, exerting pressure on Taiwan. I mean, it is international law that there is a one China policy. Taiwan is part of China. And who is meddling? It's not China meddling in Taiwan. The United States has just sent 200 so-called military advisors to Taiwan who will do military training and other advisory, in quote, activities. People who have a longer memory should remember that the Vietnam War started with advisors. So then naturally Taiwan now got 400 ground-based Harpoon anti-ship missiles. And that is like, if China would send weapons to Texas to secede and send military advisors to California, I mean, what would be the reaction? So I think it is quite clear who is the confrontationist faction and who is trying to maintain a peaceful world. So I can only encourage you. I mean, if many people are extremely worried and correctly think that the danger of world war is still on the rise, it's not going down, because you not only have the Ukraine crisis, which is not resolved at all, but now you have the clear shift to, the Indo-Pacific, the, things in the South China Sea, but especially around Taiwan. And we should remember that there was a Rand Corporation study several years ago, which said the sooner the war happens with China, the better, because the longer it takes, the more strong China becomes. So, I think that this is not a good situation, and I would really urge people to look at the conference proceedings. I mean, we had an extraordinary, really some outstanding contributions from the speakers, naturally, the former president and ministers. We had a beautiful message from a Peace Nobel laureate, Esquivel from Argentina. We had a message from a Russian astronaut, and, very important, the message by two former generals of the East German army, really making a moving statement that German tanks should not march towards Russia again. And then naturally many, many other topics. So please watch this conference, because, it is, that has been expressed by many people as well. It's one of the only places, if not the only one, where real strategic solutions are being offered and discussed.
And the conference is archived at theschillerinstitute.com. And I would add to what you just said that it's also the only place where you'll find a philosophical approach, because for the most part, philosophy has been killed in the West. Now, Helga, let me start with the first question, which is from a German foreign policy analyst. And sticking with Europe just for a moment, he wrote, "Thank you for your defense of German sovereignty by insisting on a full investigation by the German government of the charges that Biden is responsible for the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines." Then he refers to Seymour Hersh's recent article, which warns that U.S. troops are deployed on Ukraine's borders in Romania and Poland, and that they may be sent into the war. So he asks, do you think U.S. officials are willing to take the risk of triggering World War III by going into battle against Russian forces?
Well, I think that is very difficult to answer. I'm not in the head of these people. I can only say that, the famous red lines are being crossed all the time. And, sometimes I wonder, how patient especially Russia is, because the red lines, the NATO expansions were red lines. This has been stated several years ago, with the placement of the anti-ballistic missile system in Poland and Romania. There were security conferences in Moscow saying there comes a point where we cannot allow this to continue any further, and many other such events. So I don't know. I think there is a chicken game involved very clearly. A chicken game is where two cars are driving towards each other full speed, and the one which gets on the brakes first is chickening out and loses. Sometimes, I have the feeling that the NATO forces are, applying this lesson of the chicken game. And if you look at the Pentagon Papers, the leaks which were now coming out, are really something to be studied in detail, because not only became it clear that the Western media, in complete coordination, were lying through their teeth about the actual situation in Ukraine, about the war, portraying it as if Ukraine is about to win, and when the reality obviously is very different. But also, the idea that it is Russia and China who are the aggressive one. I mean, the fact is that the US military budget is more than $800 billion. That is 8 or 9 times, that is more than 8 or 9 countries following behind in terms of the size of the budget together. The United States has about anywhere between 800 and 1,000 bases around the globe, as compared to, one base of China in Somalia and whatever, it's negligent what these other countries have. So, who is trying to build up an overwhelming, power posture, by, insisting that by the aura of power and the actual military to back this aura up, that the United States is the only superpower, the unipolar, the guarantor of the unipolar world. I don't know if these people are conscious what they are doing. I mean, there are some military doctrines which say that tactical nuclear war can be won, regional nuclear war can be won. The whole introduction of so-called small nuclear weapons, which blurs the difference between conventional and nuclear weapons, all of that portrays or goes in the direction to make one believe that, there is a certain willingness to risk, and I think that the only answer to that can be that more people, and I know that from our organizing, many, many people are extremely worried about that we are close to a world war, but people are not active enough. The problem is that despite the fact that the peace movement or the beginning of some, articulation of peace movement, it's much too small. I mean, it's it's a few thousand in the United States who went to the Rage Against War, the War Machine demonstration in February. You had 50,000 in Berlin in, I think it was March. But, I think the 1st of May demonstration, at least in Europe, where, there will be demonstrations, should be used for a powerful manifestation against the war, and by that giving a message to the governments who are pursuing this policy, like this G7 group which just met in Japan, that the population is not going to take it and that they will be voted out at the first possible occasion, because these governments clearly have no right to gamble away the peace of the world and the existence of civilization. And for the media, I can only say that what came out in these Pentagon media should also be taken by heart, because I think it has reached a point where it is so bad that when you listen to certain media, it is almost not one news which does not have a spin. So maybe we should rename, for example, Deutschlandfunk into Radio Free Europe. That was the propaganda organ of the West during the time of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But I think Deutschlandfunk is doing a very good job to fill that void. So let's call Deutschlandfunk Radio Free Europe from now on.
Well, Helga, we're getting a few comments on the G7 conference. Someone who appears to be agreeing with you is Colin, who writes, would it be right to say that the G7 is the 7 most accomplished thieves? But then there's a question from Marcelo, who writes, it's clear that one cannot expect to have any solution from the G7. The question is, how can the BRICS nations accelerate and solve the Ukraine war and avoid a Taiwan conflict?
Well, I think they are doing a lot, I mean, first of all, I think the only potentially bright spot is that President Macron seems to be serious in trying to engage China in, having China play a bigger role in the solution between Ukraine and Russia. I think that's a baby step coming from somebody in Europe, which hopefully will contribute to the solution. I think, in a certain sense, the thing which really totally, flabbergasts me is the inability of the establishments of the G7 to reflect that their system is failing. I mean, what do you have right now? You have a flight out of the dollar, a de-dollarization going on full speed, whereby, not only Russia has completely, been cut off, obviously, and now they are creating a new currency, a new payment system. President Lula of Brazil was just in China inaugurating the presidency of former President Dilma Rousseff to be the new head of the new development bank. This is the Bank of the BRICS, which was there for several years, but now it's supposed to take on a completely new role in lending to countries of the global south for their industrial development. And I think the new development bank has the potential, I think President Lula said, to become the great bank of the global south. And, this is exactly what was needed. This is what my late husband, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, already proposed in 1975 when he proposed the International Development Bank. This was a concept which became very influential in the non-aligned movement, including in their final resolution in 1976 in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And now, at that time, there was a massive counter movement going against these developing countries. Indira Gandhi, Mrs. Bandaranaike, they were all destabilized. Bhutto was eventually killed. And for many years, there was the non-aligned movement did not really have a big role. But now this is changing. They are fully back. They are the global majority. They are allied with China. They are allied with Russia. The BRICS have new membership effort. How do you call this? There are more members now, more countries of the global south who want to become members of the BRICS. 24 altogether. So that's the vast majority of the global population and the global economy. So I think, and that is now a fact. Why is this happening? Well, it's an act of defense against the sanctions against Russia, but also against Iran, Venezuela, and many other countries, Syria, Yemen. And the countries of the global south are moving to self-defend by de-dollarizing. Now, it took a very long time for the top people in the West to realize that, but there is now a careful, recognition that that's the case. Janet Yellen basically said, there is a de-dollarization, and that is the result of the sanctions. Then Larry Summers, the former president of the Federal Reserve, said, yes, there is a de-dollarization going on. We are on the right side of history, but that side is becoming a very lonely place, which is a funny way of putting it, that the majority of the world is moving in another direction. And even Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, came to the same conclusion, saying, because of the sanctions, there is a de-dollarization going on. And given the fact that it was only the global role of the dollar as a basically universal currency, that, the rest of the world was de facto financing all the deficit spending of the United States. So the United States had just to print money and finance their various also military operations, and nothing would ever happen because the role of the dollar was unquestioned. But this is now changing. So, this obviously is a very dangerous moment because, I don't think that the powers to be will be satisfied with just seeing their whole system disintegrate. But, what the easiest way to get out of that would be to say, okay, if the sanctions lead to a de-dollarization, let's stop the sanctions. There was recently a meeting in the United Nations where a vast majority of countries denounced the method of sanctions. Why? Because, sanctions are never hitting the political elite because they are normally well-to-do and, they can take a certain amount of pressure. Sanctions normally target the normal population. They make food more expensive, medicine unavailable, increase the poverty. And, they are aimed to cause regime change by making the population so upset with their government that a regime change becomes possible. Now, that is obviously, a very, very brutal way of conducting policy because the victims is the poor, the women, the children, the old, the sick. So the sanctions should just stop. And I can only say that, if there is supposed to be a good solution out of this present crisis. I think more people in the global north, that is Europe and the United States, have to recognize that there is only one way, and that is to support the countries of the global south, because they are absolutely correct to demand an end of the colonial system. That colonial system formally ended several decades ago, but not in reality, because if you have no access to credit, if you have no access to normal trade conditions, then the regime of colonialism continues to exist. So now they are trying to change that for good and insist on their right for industrial development. And Europe should support that. If Germany, for example, which used to have a very good image in the developing countries, wants to get back to, have recognition, then that is what Germany should do. It would be in the self-interest of Germany, for example, or France or Italy for that matter, and even the United States. If the United States wants to, be part of a community of republics, like John Quincy Adams, one of the first presidents of the young American Republic, was proposing, everybody would be happy. Even at this extremely late point in the history, in the confrontation, the whole world would absolutely accept it. And I think we have to strengthen the people inside the United States and inside the European countries who make that point, that the global south, Russia, China, are not the enemy, but we have to find a way to cooperate.
Well, on that broad point, I just got a message from a friend in Algeria who said, I had heard about Yellen's comments about sanctions and Larry Summers and now Lagarde, but they're not talking about any change in the policy. Why? And he asks, is it a lack of respect for the rest of the world, or are they just so committed to the colonial system that they can't change?
Well, I think it's a combination of various things. I think foremost it's arrogance. I know that there are many people in so-called top positions in the establishment institutions who would not even consider for one moment that they could be wrong. They are so full of themselves, so absolutely insisting that, take Joseph Borrell with his infamous remark about that Europe lives in a garden and everything else is a jungle, and that the Europeans have to make sure that the jungle does not grow into this beautiful garden. What nonsense is this? The condition of the West is not so glorious that you would think of it as a beautiful garden. If you would think of it a garden, then a garden full of manure, full of wheat, full of garbage, that's the reality of that beautiful garden. And many other cultures have fantastic cultures, are doing much more to revive their own best traditions, like China, India, Vietnam, Thailand, many countries in Asia, Persia, Afghanistan. There are many countries who are consciously looking at their long millennia tradition of culture. And, in one sense, they have to contribute at this point in history much more than the West. The West is not doing well. I think we have gone the wrong way. We have allowed the neoliberal excesses. Everything is allowed. Everything goes. If you say that, there should be a aesthetic education in Germany to improve the moral character, then you are autocrat. This is Friedrich Schiller, this is the high point of humanism. But if you would demand, the Schiller Institute naturally does that, if you demand what was normal at the high point of German classical culture, you are called an autocrat, a dictator. You're not allowing that everybody can do whatever they please. But, you have the drug legalization in Germany right now. This is completely insane. the reports about where that led to in Holland, in Netherlands, are all over the place, that it did not decrease criminalization, it did not decrease the number of addicts, or the United States for that matter, where the rate of suicides, drug-related among young people, is skyrocketing. Nevertheless, they are doing it in Germany. Even our health minister, Lauterbach, who used to be against it because he knew better, he has now capitulated. So there is a tendency in the West, where I keep saying, we don't need China to subvert us because we are doing it all by ourselves. So I think the Western elite, as of now, I think they have demonstrated a remarkable inability to reflect and to correct their mistakes. They're doing the opposite. They're, every time they are confronted with the failure of their policy, they blame Russia, they blame China, and then they do more of the same. I think it's quite clinical,
Now, here's something from Thomas, who wrote and said, "Thank you for a beautiful and insightful conference, and most important for the philosophical dialogue, because that is really lacking among nations." And then he asks, what is the best way to organize people to understand and see through the lies from the Western media? And I assume he's saying through philosophical dialogue.
Yeah, I think that is really very true. I have proposed these 10 principles for a new security and development architecture, where the 7 first principles are sort of programmatic and fairly obvious and straightforward. But I added deliberately the last 3 principles, to add what you could call a philosophical or metaphysical dimension to that, because if you don't straighten out the method of thinking, how comes that people come concerning the same event to completely different conclusions? How do you account for that? It obviously has to do with the fact that what causes you to make a certain judgment is the axiomatic basis of your thinking. What are your axioms about, fundamental issues like the image of man or the nature of government or, similar questions like that, the principles of economic development. These are questions, if you say the image of man is a beast, and therefore you need a Leviathan, you need an all-powerful state to, control the evil impulses of the wicked nature of man. Well, then you are arriving at the unipolar world and you say, no, we need a rules-based order. The rules have to be decided by an unipolar institution and everybody else has to submit to that. Now that's the problem, what we see right now. But, if you think that man is by nature good, that was the view in most of European theology and philosophy for the last, or at least a certain current in the last 2,000 years. This was basically Plato, Augustinus, Nicholas of Cus, Thomas of Aquinas, Leibniz, Schiller, many others. While they have a completely different conception, they think that each human being has a potential, and it is the duty of that person to develop that potential to the fullest. That's even in the Bible, that everybody gets talents, and I think, I don't know which part of the Bible that is in, but that you are not allowed to bury your talents, even if you preserve them, but you have to develop them. And the same is true, for every current Nicholas of Cusa, for example, who said that the evil comes from a lack of development, and that therefore you have to do everything possible to develop your talents, your skills, your character. And there were several great thinkers who had methods of how you can do that. Naturally, in religion, and that's in most religions, you are obliged to, be good because you have to follow the religious rules. You have to imitate Christ. You have to imitate God. There's a moral reason coming from the religion to become better. But such thinkers, for example, as Friedrich Schiller, he recognized that there was also a condition in politics, like when the state is corrupt and the masses are degenerate, how do you improve the character when it doesn't come from the top, from the government, and it does not come organically out of the masses because the masses are depraved and degenerated. And then Schiller develops this beautiful conception about the aesthetic education, that there are certain ways how great art is uplifting the soul and the mind of the person, and that the more you study great music, great poetry, great painting, and other forms of classical art, you study the creativity of the artist in the moment of creation. And in the moment you totally evolve yourself in the piece of great art. You become a better person, because it works on your soul, it works on your emotions. And Schiller, for example, was convinced, and I fully agree with him, that great art has the effect that it remains even after the performance of the piece of music or the drama is over, because it continues to work in you as a force of the good. So, people are responsible for what they become. Every person has a potential when they are young, and then they can use that for a certain period of time. And when they mistreat themselves by allowing bad things to inflict on their soul, then sooner or later the potential is out. And that's why you see so many people who are bitter when they reach a certain age and they don't want to change anymore because they have used up their potential. So the best advice is that you have to pay attention to the beauty of your soul and the creative power of your mind and work on it, because genius is a lot of work. So I think we need to have a discussion of how to improve society, because that is not an autocratic approach. It is, something which used to be, the normal way of thinking in the times we had high periods of culture. And the fact that we don't think this way anymore is a reflection of the fact that we are living in a dark age in the West and in a complete degenerate period of our history, which we must urgently reverse.
If you've just joined us, this is our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and we're in the question and answer session. We're running a little short on time, but I do have a couple more questions I'd like to get to you, Helga. One I think is interesting because a lot of people have this confusion between the question of sovereignty, decentralization. Someone on the chat said they think decentralization of world government is the key to world peace. And by world government, they're talking about the NATO, World Economic Forum, UN, and so on. What do you think of that?
Not necessarily. Obviously, unipolar world is no good because it's a form of dictatorship. But multipolarity as such does not mean peace, because it could mean, for example, that you have a US bloc, a European bloc, Russian bloc, Chinese bloc, some other emerging blocs, and geopolitics would still continue to exist. And I think it is the question of geopolitics which has to be overcome. Because geopolitics was the reason why we had 2 world wars in the 20th century. And I think, as long as you have one country or a group of countries who say that they have to defend their interest against another country or another group of countries, you always have the conflict of, interest, and it could lead to, in the worst case, a big war. I think we have reached a point in history where we have to think about it very much different. In the past, in the Roman Empire could collapse and nobody else in the rest of the world would even know about it, because it would take several months, if not years, to travel to the furthest corner of China or wherever. And, similarly, you could have other empires and cultures collapse, and it would take months and years. Nobody would be affected by it. But we have now reached a point in the development of mankind. We have nuclear weapons. If it comes to a big war, all of humanity would be annihilated. We have the internet. We could be connected in nanoseconds with everybody around the world. We have pandemics, which we just experienced, which affects everybody, and especially naturally the poorest countries. If they are defenseless, it makes very clear we are sitting in one boat. So I could give a much longer list of such reasons why we are really interconnected. And that's why I think we have to make an evolutionary jump to think about the one humanity before we think national sovereignty. I think national sovereignty is absolutely crucial, because it is, at least in the present period of history, the only way how the individual can participate in government. But, I think the idea that we never can have an interest of one country against the interest of all others, but that we have to think of how can we define the interest of the one humanity in such a way that my country or my nation or my civilization somehow fits in an affinity with that totality. And that is only through development. So I think, we have to move into a direction of, really thinking about the great interest of humanity first, and then somehow make the national interest fit into that, rather than thinking my country first and then all others. So I think, that is I think it's an evolutionary thing, because if we move to commercial use of thermonuclear power, which is on the horizon now in a serious fashion, well, then we will have energy security for everybody. We will have eventually raw material security for everybody. We think about international space science and space cooperation, and when you are an astronaut, thinking about how to build a village on the moon, if you are reasonable, you're not thinking about a German village on the moon and an American village on the moon and a Russian village on the moon, but you're thinking about a human village on the moon where everybody cooperates. And that will become more and more. If you're thinking about a city on Mars, which may take another generation or whatever, you're not going to do that in replicating the divisions which exist on the Earth, but you will arrive at a unity. And since we should look at the conditions on Earth from the perspective from the future, I think that gives us a key of how to tackle all kinds of problems on Earth right now.
And I think a good starting point for people to get into that level of discussion is to look at the videos from the conference, where we had people from virtually every continent in the world, from different political groups. It was in a sense, it was a break out of the political profiles of left, right, and so on. And I think people could get so much from starting with that and then thinking about what you've presented so far today. Helga, we've pretty much run out of time. I'd like to thank everyone who sent in their questions. And Helga, let me thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Well, then let me thank you for asking me these questions. See you next week.